What are the benefits of free trade and how can it lead to greater levels of prosperity in society? Well, joining me to discuss this idea is Chris Hattingh. He is the Deputy Director at the Free Market Foundation in Johannesburg. Chris Hattingh, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thanks very much, David. Only a pleasure to get to talk to you again. Despite the supply chain crunch, I managed to get here on time, so I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. No delays in our podcast this week.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we'll certainly get into some of those supply chain issues because I think global supply chains, global value chains are certainly something that characterizes the contemporary world, and those have been shown to be actually quite fragile, particularly during the COVID crisis. But let's start off with the general principle of free trade. And for the last several hundred years, since Adam Smith was writing in 1776, I think it was, free trade has been something that has driven growth and prosperity around the world. But it's not always something that's particularly popular. And in many ways, it's a bit of a counterintuitive idea that the more open you are, the more you engage and trade with others, the more your overall prosperity improves. Could you explain what are some of the benefits of free trade?
So a lot that factors into the general benefits of free trade focuses around the concepts of comparative advantage as one, and then secondly, the division of labor. So it's one thing to be self-sustaining, for example, yourself and your family on your small plot of land and you can grow vegetables and that kind of thing. But it's another thing when you're able to obtain, for example, finished products that make it easier for you to farm, and you can spend more of your time on other things like skills, developing some of your skills, maybe investing your time in other ways, trying to have a job from 9 to 5, whereas you would normally, not even 100 years ago, be spending the vast majority of your time trying to just do basic sustenance for yourself and for your family and just finding enough food, as it were, never mind all the products and things that we have nowadays. So just it's important to keep in mind the division of labor point when you can get someone else, as it were, to do the work for you. You, of course, exchange things of value with them. And then also just the comparative advantage point. You might be better at some things and someone else might be better at other things. If you can bring those together on a countrywide and global level, then it just ratchets up exponentially the amount of things, and the complicated nature of those things increases as well exponentially. If one has in mind a sort of graph of technological development the last 100 years, the amount of time it took to develop, for example, the aeroplane versus how quickly it's been now for the Internet of Things to take off, it's just becoming more and more exponentially faster if you think about the more connected that the world has become. Now, on your point of it being almost counterintuitive, one can say, and I recommend that people go and read Johan Norberg's book on this entitled Open. It came out last year, I think, or early this year. But he goes into this a lot on the psychology and the history, especially. And just if you think, as apes, as we are, we don't necessarily, when someone comes with something new or something unknown or unforeseen, we either fight against it or we flee from it. And that's why it goes against maybe our sort of more primal brain to be interconnected and to trust people with whom we deal. That's part of the argument. The wider argument for free markets is that you can, and it's to your benefit, to trade with someone who's of a different religion, a different cultural background, different upbringing, as it were, that you wouldn't normally be, because it's to both of your advantages to trade with each other in terms of material goods, expertise, skills, that sort of thing. So it's interesting how it's been to our benefit, our more globalized world, which isn't to say it's a panacea for everything. It has its own risks, of course, but just how much prosperity and upliftment out of poverty has happened as a result of freer trade and more connected markets around the world. Some regions, unfortunately, still don't reap all the benefits of that. And we can get into, there's historical reasons, of course. And at this point in time, one could argue a lot of bureaucratic taxation, onerous red tape that inhibits countries from growing through trade. But overall, I think one can say that the case for freer trade has been very strong over the last 100 years.
Okay, and free trade has resulted in rising prosperity, not just for rich countries, but also for poorer countries that are able to offer something to those richer countries and and end up uplifting themselves, particularly the East Asian tigers, if you will. But I wanted to explore this concept of comparative advantage a bit further, Chris, because that's also a bit of a counterintuitive idea that if you focus on a narrower range of activities and have this division of labor, not just at the micro level, like you described, a family or a household, but actually at a country level, that different countries are better able to compete. So for example, in China, there's a very high appetite, high demand for soy products, but China is not actually the best place to grow soy. That would be a place like Argentina, which has a very rich and fertile soil, which favors growing that kind of crop. So if those two countries trade with each other, China gets the benefit of satisfying its demand for soy, and Argentina gets to sell its product. So could you explain also this concept of comparative advantage a bit more in a bit more detail?
Yeah, and then I would also say, before we get into the answer itself, it's often we're tempted to think of trade in terms of country levels, and actually we should think in terms of individuals trading with each other, because once we start with the framework of country levels, then it becomes a case of what industrial policies should be in place, what resources, quote unquote, should governments decide are more important than others, what skills do their people have that they should develop more than others, should they invest in it. So it's always important to keep in mind it's individuals trading with each other. I mean, when you think of, then you run into the idea and the concerns around trade deficits. Well, when I go to Pick n Pay to buy my weekly basket of groceries, technically I'm running a deficit with Pick n Pay because I've given them money. But you can't just in trade think in terms of just money exchanging hands. It's values exchanging hands. If I buy an iPhone now, it's not worth 1,000 Rand to me. It's worth more than 1,000 Rand. So if I'm trading with someone overseas, then, I'm, all things considered, and I might make irrational decisions, but I'm thinking I'm going to get more value from what I'm getting from them than I'm, quote unquote, sacrificing or giving up. So just on the comparative advantage point specifically, I think you run into the sort of the hurdle in economics where not everyone can do everything, and resources are limited, time is limited, skills are limited, all that kind of stuff. So if you can think of everything being equal, where can you, quote unquote, get an advantage, or where can you save more time, as it were? Where can you save more of your mental capacity, as it were, to spend on other things? Where is the geography better for some things versus other things, like you mentioned soy in Argentina as just one example? Where can you make sure that you have more time in terms of wealth? A lot of people think of wealth in terms of material sort of terms and understandings, but I would argue that leisure and more free time is a good indication of wealth and what can give one that advantage, as it were. You should also think in terms of effort being put into something. So, for example, we could make South Africa, I don't know, a manufacturing hub on the level of China, but what's it going to take to get there? So what is the relative, because all countries are relative to each other. We shouldn't take a country in isolation, but what is needed to get to a certain level, and where are the small ratchet points that you could implement, where it's not a case of, for example, in South Africa, implementing localization policy and saying we're going to reindustrialize the whole country, but rather focusing on certain areas. Maybe it's automotive, maybe it's agriculture, which is very strong in South Africa. Maybe that's a better area to focus on. So you should take it on a country case by case basis, and not just assume that, for example, the Africa Free Trade Area means that all African countries are going to get to the same level at the same time.
So many critics of free trade, Chris, would say something to the effect of, well, actually free trade benefits the incumbents, the big multinationals or the big industrialized nations. And this is just a way for these countries to assert their already existing advantage over smaller, poorer nations. And that this is essentially extractive, that the smaller nations have less sophisticated economies, they're resource intensive or dependent on natural resources in the ground, or in other aspects of the environment, and that basically free trade is just an excuse to extract rents and advantage from poorer countries and poorer societies. What would you make of that argument?
I think there's a lot to be said for that argument. And I couch that now in the context of the COP26 agreement and a lot of the discussions around developing countries, quote unquote, receiving funds to move to renewable energies. And if you look at previous COP conferences, countries such as India especially have pointed out, well, more developed countries use these fossil fuels to get to a certain level of development. Now you're asking us, you're sort of condemning us to poverty kind of idea. Now you can discuss renewables and the technology and is the cost decreasing, all that sort of stuff. But I think it's an important example of highlighting this concern around free trade. And is it now just set up, to quote unquote favor the bigger countries? And a body like the World Trade Organization is very important in this regard, which makes it all the more sad that the appellate body of the WTO isn't functioning as it should, which is a result of previous US President Donald Trump, his administration blocking appointments to that appellate body. And this isn't to say that the WTO would be perfect, but that's one body where, for example, if a country imposes very high duties or subsidies, that case can be taken by a business, for example, or a civil society organization to the WTO. And one hopes that is adjudicated on well. I mean, this is often, I guess, an argument against the sort of liberal worldwide institutions that they have shortcomings, that kind of thing. I don't think that should be used necessarily to undermine a lot of their benefits, but it should be used to strengthen them and improve them where they're weak, and not by assuming just because the WTO is a global body that it will act in the best interests of every single country, as it were. I almost think it would be better in some ways for countries to do bilateral agreements, which are a bit more nimble and not just bind themselves to the big WTO, as it were. This is more of a meta point, but when one thinks of people trading with each other, for me from the outside, you might trade with someone else and come to some sort of agreement or transaction, which to me is deeply irrational. And I shouldn't assume that to be the case. It's up to you to sort of decide that for yourself. And we shouldn't assume that because developing countries, for example, are deciding to export more of their raw materials, that therefore it's an immoral position or it's wrong or something like that. They've come to that decision. Yes, they're coming from a weaker position than a more developed nation like the US or China, but they have come to that decision sort of on their own merits. And I think we should be tempered by that sort of paternalist desire, as it were, to step in the whole time and intervene. I would say that, especially now with the world being a bit more globalized and a lot more globalized, and where people can go to different areas of the globe for what they need, one would hope that in a more globalized, connected world, people would ostracize those countries with whom they disagree and decide not to trade with them. Now, again, it's a voluntary thing. You don't sort of want a world police, as it were, deciding who you may trade with or not. But one hopes that the more people get to trade with each other, they realize in what context that should take place, on what basis, not, for example, using slave labor as just one example, which still happens, unfortunately, in too many places around the world. I think withholding trade from countries is a very good way to try and get them to reform. It's not, again, perfect, but I think it could arguably be a bit more effective even than sanctions, because with sanctions, those regimes simply get their income, quote unquote, and support from other corrupt regimes, whereas trade sanctions might cut them off from certain other resources and make it more difficult for them to rule. So yeah, to go back to the original question, we should take concerns around free trade seriously if we really want to advocate it and want it to be as beneficial to as many people as possible. It's not to just be brushed off as, oh, you're just looking inward or whatever. Countries have very real concerns and legitimate concerns around their histories and who they've been traded with and maybe, in their view, exploited by. And if you don't take those seriously, as the WTO, for example, if you're that body, then the world will become more isolationist and some international forms of trade will become more brittle, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I thought your point earlier about multilateral institutions was quite interesting, Chris, because I mean, if you think of a body like the European Union, there's a benefit there to some extent in terms of harmonization of trade policy, that a country like South Africa or another developing country can trade with this unitary bloc, and there's a clear set of terms of that trade. But on the other hand, that harmonization also comes with centralization and trying to encompass all of the varying interests of the member states. You end up having protections for all of these special interests spread out throughout the whole continent. And so a country like South Africa, for example, needs to be able to have access to European markets in terms of citrus fruit, for example. But now they're competing with Southern European citrus growers in Portugal or Italy, somewhere like that. And that means then that the tariffs and protections of that common agricultural area are going to be now locking out a country like South Africa. So in many ways, that actually creates a lot of distortions in the global trade environment.
We're seeing in general, not just in trade, but the concept of decentralization and bringing things back to the community, as it were. So I think if we can keep some of these multilateral institutions, but work in the on the ground knowledge, and this is not directly linked, but I'm thinking of the concept of subsidiarity and just the making what is right for that area's responsibility. I think we could then have a bit more, you can have the benefits of the global trading system with the sort of human, moral, emotional connection of on the ground and responding to people's concerns. Like in the US, for example, then you're more better able to respond to concerns around manufacturing leaving the country, quote unquote, which would then do better to assuage populist concerns coming up in the future, which politicians will always try to exploit, regardless of what country they're which country they're from.
Yeah, and here on the podcast, we have long advocated for decentralization, political federalism, and also locally driven bottom-up solutions to some of these problems. But I think that that's distinct and different from localization, as it's often put forward by governments. And here in South Africa, we have a very assertive Ministry of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC, which has implemented a raft of quotas, import duties, and other protections that are designed and intended to protect local industry from foreign competition or from dumping or something like that, but have the effect of actually reducing the competitiveness of South Africa's firms. So unintended consequence there, quite a harmful one. What are some of the problems as you see it with this concept of localization as put forward by our government bureaucrats?
I think you're absolutely right to raise why it's not the kind of localization that we necessarily want. One should always, when something comes from government, I guess, be quite, and also from bigger businesses, big corporates, be quite skeptical. And it's not the kind of robust localization that one would want. It's like saying, for example, that government is the only method to bring about a diverse society, whereas it's a strong moral diverse society comes up organically by growing and sort of dealing with each other and building businesses and communities. Just on South Africa's localization specifically, so in my understanding, in my sort of analysis, localization can come about in two ways. One of those is through subsidies. And now we've got these 42 products which have been designated for localization, and those products or their inputs, the different parts that make up the product get a subsidy. Or so it's through subsidies, or it's through higher tariffs and duties and other taxes on imported goods. That's how you bring about localization. Then you have to ask, who was in the room when it was decided which products are designated, which get the subsidies, which businesses were involved? Each product will ostensibly have a champion in the private sector. Now, are those going to be bigger businesses? Why those ones and not other ones? Will transformation targets be used to decide who gets a subsidy and who doesn't, regardless maybe of the number of jobs created? In a country with a 44% unemployment rate, can we afford to have that sort of nitty-gritty mingling interference, both from the DTIC and maybe from the Department of Labor? Maybe they'll decide together if a certain business is transformed enough or not, quote unquote. And then when you run into the issue of tariffs and duties, if a product has been decided for localization, you need to ask, that means people can afford it cheaper if it's imported versus exported. So is it up to a panel of bureaucrats, for example, to decide that a certain product is too cheap, quote unquote, in South Africa, and therefore it should be made more expensive? I mean, given inflation concerns, especially, and just how many lower to middle income South Africans there are, any potential government plan to me that increases people's daily cost of living is pretty much unconscionable given the current context, as we're heading out of 2 years of a pandemic, which caused its own hardships and killed family members and closed down businesses on top of government imposed lockdowns. Can you really afford to have this sort of interference by the state, which will increase people's cost of living and just operations of doing business? And this is a bit of a meta point, but trade isn't just about products and services, but it's also about the movement of people and skills and talents across borders. So, but by pursuing this sort of inward-looking protectionist policy of localization, we're also signaling to the rest of Africa, and I would argue the world, that we're not necessarily that friendly to different people coming in and bringing their skills to bear in South Africa and building businesses and bringing their capital. And which isn't to say that people from the rest of Africa are going to bring massive amounts of capital, but you need that sort of moving economy, as it were, that just economic activity. You're not going to get 5% per annum economic growth like some of our peer countries are predicting to have over the next 5 years. We're going to have our 1.6% growth for the next 5 years. That's not going to do anything to resolve the 74% youth unemployment rate. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent now, just on the general negative effects of localization, but I don't think it's the right path to really develop economic growth in South Africa. I would argue that, and don't tell any of my fellow liberals and libertarians this, but if you're going to have a government involvement in some ways, then have programs for skills development, have programs of actual good education development with deliverables where you get private sector expertise, where, for example, you can then make sure that you organically develop South Africa's manufacturing base, as an example, maybe in automotive. Then you really can compete with other countries and you don't have to worry about that input. But don't try to make it a blanket approach and decide on these products. I mean, just some of the products there's wedding gowns as one example, and I think another one was fig jam. So I don't know, maybe it was the previous finance minister really likes fig jam and he decided to put that item on the list. But it just makes you wonder, really, we shouldn't be tinkering like this, with central planning and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and another pillar to the localization strategy is preferential procurement. I was watching a webinar by the Center for Development and Enterprise, and they've released a paper called The Siren Song of Localization, which was co-authored by a couple of economists. And one of the co-authors was David Kaplan. And he was saying that when you are the state and you say a particular good or service is only going to be procured locally, you're sending a signal to that provider that they don't have to worry about foreign competition anymore. They have a captive market in the form of a state-owned enterprise. And so inevitably the quality of that good or service is going to decline. And another pillar of the DTI strategy is subsidizing certain industries, as you mentioned, the motor industry being the most prominent example. The motor industry development plan costs the taxpayer billions. But that's an important area of job creation. So goes the argument. And I certainly think that there is a role to be played for South African manufacturing, which has shrunk as a proportion of GDP, to plug into global value chains. But I think, to your point, you need to provide consistent energy, good rail and port infrastructure. You need a labor market that's flexible and dynamic. That will improve the competitiveness of those industries, rather than the government just throwing money at those nascent industries.
And you wonder, at what point will the localization be achieved, as it were, the final sort of goal? Will subsidies just exist ad infinitum? If you really want robust supply chains and good competition in your country, you want your businesses and industry to be subject to market forces. So it's all well and good now. One talks about the concerns around globalization and the pandemic, for example. It was easier for COVID to spread, and I agree with that. It was also easier for vaccines to be developed, for people to share the technology, for the knowledge to move around the world, for people to deal with this new threat. It's one thing to have walls around your city or your country, but if you can't see over those walls, you can't prepare accordingly and know what's coming and make sure that you're robust enough to survive. So if we think, South Africa and other developed countries were battered by COVID-19, just wait till the next pandemic or the next black swan event. And those countries, which I think are more isolationist now, will be more ill prepared for those future shocks. That's not the best way to bring about resilient supply chains. You need to, diversify as much as possible. Not that I'll ever, try and give anyone financial advice, but it's the same concept. You're not going to just be invested in Bitcoin, for example. Your supply chains are also not just going to be invested in one place necessarily. Which is, again, the benefit of a globalized world.
Yeah, and being exposed to foreign competition and all of these unexpected trends and forces actually makes you more robust, makes you more innovative, and you just have to respond to changes in technology or changes in labor markets, or whatever the case may be. But you mentioned this kind of principle of subsidiarity, and this is a theme that Stephen Davies of the Institute of Economic Affairs outlined in my previous episode with him. And he spoke of some of the shortcomings of this just-in-time supply chains, that these incredibly long supply chains that have many different components. And as we've seen, it only takes a few disruptions, a container vessel getting stuck in the Suez Canal, and this has a ripple effect throughout the global economy. So how do we make some of those supply chains a bit shorter without sacrificing some of the benefits of free trade?
So if we look at specifically the Africa Free Trade Area, Continental Free Trade Area, and the spirit in which that was developed, and hopefully the effects it will have, that will mean a higher manufacturing in general and industrialization base across Africa, at least in some parts, which means Africa as a continent can become a bit more self-reliant, as it were, and for the appropriate things to be developed closer to home, as it were. So, and Stephen Davies is correct on this point. It can't just be a case of, I don't think it can be a case of everything being developed in this place, shipped to that place, shipped to that place. It's much more a case of different components being assembled in different areas and maybe being put together in one place and being shipped to another. So we should definitely, I think, focus on those important products, healthcare especially nowadays, now with our more globalized world. How do we make sure that with the next pandemic, developing countries aren't forced to go at every international summit and convention and talk about vaccine apartheid, for example? Well, you don't do that by abandoning intellectual property rights overnight, because that's not going to that's not going to spring up a factory in Port Elizabeth overnight. You need to develop the skills, the knowledge, the expertise in your countries. And that again comes about through the sharing of knowledge and ideas. So I'm hoping, just as the biggest example, through the free trade agreement, through the free trade area, that African governments take advantage of that to bring more people to Africa and to develop those industries, those insights, all that knowledge here, so that people can apply it in this context. I mean, it's almost pithy to say, but we lose sight of these insights, I think, and the knowledge of people on the ground, sort of local knowledge. Now, it's not people who have necessarily gone to university, but there's a different, and I think in some ways a more real knowledge and insight from people who live in their communities and on the ground, where they better understand the challenges that they face. And if they have some of the technical knowledge, then they can better figure out how to make sure that they are both integrated into economies around them, and then make sure that they get the value from that. And it's not just an extractive relationship, as it were. So I think that's vital to keep in mind. Now, I do think the general trend will be towards more isolationism and protectionism, and we'll unfortunately see the negative effects of that. More and more people will become mired in grinding poverty and hunger. But you hope that here and there are some sparks, and that the right voices will carry carry the day. But, the countries that have grown well from free trade on average, it falls on them as well to really now push this envelope forward and make sure that more developing countries can also have the benefits. It's not just the case now of they should close up shop and isolate themselves. That'll also be to their detriment. So always keep in mind those countries that are richer now, if they go the more isolationist, protectionist route, I think we'll see a lot of turmoil and upheaval and declining economic growth there if they're not careful to avoid the wrong policies.
Yeah, and I think something that many people misunderstand about tariffs and subsidies and other forms of protection is that essentially this is like a tax on consumers, that most people don't like taxes. They protest fiercely whenever the government raises taxes, but never seem to have the same reaction when it comes to other protectionist or localization policies. But if you think of it that way, that just the cost of living is going to go up, the array of services and goods that you have access to is going to diminish. That ultimately makes people less well off. But you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we had Alexander Hammond of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity on the show, and he was very enthusiastic about some of the potential upsides of this. It requires a lot of elimination of tariff barriers by many African countries. So I think there's a significant coordination challenge there. There are also a lot of non-tariff barriers, roadblocks and border checks and various other things where corrupt officials can make it very difficult for goods to travel across borders. What do you think about the prospects for the African Continental Free Trade area? Do you think that it's pie in the sky, or do you think that there's real promise there?
Maybe we shouldn't share this episode with Alex afterwards, but I'm more worried, I think, about the agreement in general. And just because I think governments are too tempted by the short-term wins in their minds that they could get by, for example, hiking tariffs on a certain industry. So in South Africa, with the pressure that trade unions regularly apply, now that it seems nominally that the government is going to hold the line on the public sector wage bill, maybe now the unions are going to try and find other ways to exert pressure on bureaucrats and politicians. And one of those might be just months or years long strikes. Now it's to their own harm, but that's one way to get governments to follow them. And one of the things might be protect our industry, protect, mining or motor vehicles, or take your pick, agriculture, and not just now in terms of subsidies, but implement 20-year tariffs of 90% on certain products and goods. Make sure that South Africa doesn't import any wheat or poultry. I mean, poultry is one of the most protected industries in South Africa. A few years ago, very high duties were imposed with the sort of promise or the expectation from government side that local poultry producers would start exporting. That hasn't happened in about 3 years now. So you wonder when is it actually going to be sort of when will the subsidies and the localization be abandoned? That's just one concern of mine, is around what governments are going to do regarding the Africa Free Trade Area. For those interested in more reading, Dr. Morjini Pillay, who's at the DTIC, wrote an article in the Business Day probably about 2 or 3 months ago now, raising her own concerns about the free trade area and the effects of localization on that, whether localization won't undermine the free trade area, as it were. So that's just on our own doorstep, is our government potentially undermining the free trade area. And then I wonder about other bigger governments and countries in Africa, like Nigeria, for example, comes to mind. What will Kenya do? Ethiopia at the moment, they have their own internal security matters and strife. So you wonder, will free trade really be of utmost concern to them or not? Are they going to try and use, sort of internal strife along cultural lines to justify maybe not following all the prescripts of the Africa Free Trade Area? So I want to be optimistic about it, because it is pretty much unprecedented having this sort of agreement, pro-free trade agreement across the African continent. But there's still so much that needs to be done, which isn't to say it's not worth doing. Of course, these things are often very difficult, and the wins might be incremental and might be very small. But here and there, you hope that the right sort of things happen. Just as one example, at the Bight Bridge border post in Zimbabwe, that facility has now been massively upgraded. So you hope that at least now that it comes with some more efficiencies, that it's easier for truckers to get through, that their paperwork can be scanned digitally before they leave instead of having to sort through papers when they are at the border, resulting in massive queues. If just one or two of these border posts, as an example, can be freed up from some of the gum taking up the works, it would already be beneficial. Maybe it's better to focus on one or two areas and some low-hanging fruit instead of thinking, let's completely liberalize all African trade within a year's time. And we shouldn't abandon the free trade area as a concept and as a policy guideline if, for example, it isn't fully operational or it isn't fully implemented and adopted within a year or two. This is a long game, I think, and hopefully it portends in the right direction again if governments sort of take the right steps.
Yeah, and as Alex is quick to point out, it's also important that member countries have a very firm commitment to property rights. Now, what do you think about that relationship between property rights and free trade?
Yeah, I think it's integral both conceptually and practically. The idea of investing and building up something over the long term, if you have property in which you invest your sort of skills, your time, your expertise, then there's more of an incentive, I would argue, to trade with someone else and to make sure that your own property is secure. It's going to be difficult for you to convince someone to trade with you if what you're giving them might be gone the next morning. And if there isn't that sense of reliability and trust, I mean, money fundamentally as a form of exchange is, you can talk about paper money, seashells, gold. It's trust, that confidence, that thing signifies what it's, what you all agree that it signifies. So if South Africa implements expropriation without compensation, that's a very good way to undermine the free trade area. And it's just a good way to make sure that we aren't serious about addressing the unemployment rate, as an example. It's a way to make sure that we're talking a big game and we want reindustrialization, we want localization, but actually we don't want the capital that's necessary to bring any of that stuff about. And you only get that kind of capital investment where property rights are secure in your country. So you need to make sure that not just that you talk a big game, but that your policies follow the same direction. So again, not falling for what bureaucrats and politicians say necessarily, but seeing the reality on the ground. And again, that point of subsidiarity, seeing what are communities and businesses on the ground trying to do to solve problems, where at international investment summits, people are saying we're going to build smart cities and have bullet trains, that sort of thing. See if the rhetoric matches up with the reality on the ground, as it were.
So Chris, for those who might still have some lingering skepticism about the benefits of free trade, what would you say to them to convince them of the benefits of free trade? Because I think in many ways, part of why people are critical of free trade is that in some ways we take it for granted, that many of the benefits that we see, even just the fact that I have this phone, is the product of a globally integrated supply chain. The screen is from, Israel. Some of the precious metals in there would be from the DRC. The microchip would be from Taiwan. And you just kind of take it for granted, and you're walking around with this amazing achievement of technology in your pocket every day. So what would be the message that you would try to convey to those who might have some lingering doubts about the benefits of free trade?
I try sometimes to remind myself to not think of trade as this meta level thing, but more of when I'm driving down the street or when I go visit family in different parts of South Africa. I'm engaging in trade when I'm going into a local news cafe, when I'm buying groceries and just produce from the local supply instead of going to Whole Foods, for example. We think in terms of, if bigger businesses and corporates and governments are doing something, therefore the whole phenomenon or the concept is spoiled. Whereas I think we can see in our communities and our businesses the benefits of engaging with people of different backgrounds. And I want people to not focus, I want to say too much, but so much on the material benefits, for example, as the phone that you held up, but the richness of life that comes with getting to interact with different people. And you might well then decide that it's not for you, that you want your community to pursue a different path or set it up in a different way. Those societies and communities which have been more open and engaged with each other, I think, have experienced a lot more overall benefits in terms of material prosperity and cultural, moral, religious enrichment and growth. And that stuff only comes about when you're testing your ideas, when you're pushing with and against other people, when you're getting to deal with them, when you're getting to think through your own ideas and figure out if what you think is actually correct or whether there's another way to apply it to the challenges facing your community. So I think for those listening and watching who have a concern around South Africa's future, as I'm sure most are, I mean, that's why you're listening to someone like David and his channel and the ideas and guests that he has on, because you want solutions and you want a better country going forward. I would argue one of the best ways to do that is by dealing with other people, and free trade is one of the best ways to facilitate that phenomenon. Yeah, there might be hiccups along the road and societies might again turn more inward, but on average, I think it's better to be more open, both as an individual and just as a society and a community. You're much more robust, I think, over time than you would be if you just looked inward the whole time.
Yeah, and I think your point about aggregate improvements is really important there, Chris, because sometimes trade can also bring about disruption and creative destruction, that kind of Schumpeterian idea. So maybe your family for generations was working in a small shoe factory, and now suddenly that shoe factory is closed. And to you, you're experiencing those downsides, but on aggregate, overall incomes are going up. That might be cold comfort to you. And I think we should certainly think of ways in which we can limit the damage that is caused in the disruption, and to recapacitate people, retrain them, and help them deal with those downsides. But I think we shouldn't let that tempt us to kind of overhaul and destroy the whole free trade system, which has brought about great prosperity.
Oh, very much so. And I think if you have in general a more open attitude in your society, it's better able to adapt and deal with those destructive effects that might come about. You know, for example, the certain forms of business which get destroyed versus being taken over by other forms. You're going to be better able to deal with what comes around the corner than you normally would be. Now, we also, I think in general, have a bit of a idealistic view of the past and an idea of things were just perfect, and things worked very well for everyone, and it wasn't so materialistic and that kind of thing. And a lot of the leisure time and the time that we have to contemplate these things is a result of the more interconnected world that we have. And that doesn't mean that we're going to spend that time correctly. So if, for example, you engage with other intellectuals or people around you in your communities and you feel that they're losing sight of some of the cultural values or the moral values that should be important to them, use the time and the extra resources available to you by being more interconnected to make sure that you start some sort of community action group, or you use that time to reach out to people around you and you pursue similar values and you talk about these things and why they're important. You get involved in education, for example, not surrendering all of education to the state or, big corporates, as it were. It's up to people to use it. It's not going to be the case of it's just going to happen, by itself automatically. You actually need to make sure that you own the situation and the context in which you are, and how will you use those different tools at your disposal to make sure that you're pursuing those values and the kind of prosperity that you want for yourself and your family and your community.
Chris Hattingh, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara.
Thanks very much, David.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well. And a special note, this will be the last episode of Solutions with David Ansara for 2021. We will be resuming in January 2022. And until then, take care.